All right, well, why don't we get started? It's about 3 minutes after the hour, and we are recording, so that's good. It's always important for me to make sure I don't forget to hit that button. So I want to welcome all of our attendees today to our Zoom briefing. My name is Tom Giovanetti, and I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 34-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to welcome you all to our Zoom discussion today with our friend from the UK, a former member of the European Parliament, and now a member of the House of Lords, Syed Kamall. We appreciate you all being here with us today. We especially appreciate those of you who are financial supporters of IPI's work. Thank you very much. Your support makes this possible. And I'd like to particularly thank those of you who are members of our Giving Society, which is an organized, systematized way of supporting IPI. If after this discussion you would like to know more about the Giving Society or you'd like to become a member, I would suggest that you contact Addie Crimmins at IPI, and she would be more than happy to talk to you about that and to get you involved as a member of our Giving Society. And now let's get on to our program. I'm a fan of British politics, and I'm sort of an Anglophile, but everything I know about British politics comes to me from Yes Minister. And I thought I would do a little show and tell today and show off my boxed set of Yes Minister DVDs. And for those of you in the audience, if you don't know what Yes Minister is, you need to rectify that, because it's probably the most brilliant political television show that's ever been produced. And so, Syed, that's where I get all my knowledge of how of how British politics works in Parliament. Well, that and House of Cards, since we're having show and tell.
The original one or the American version?
Well, no, this is the British version, and I want to point out to all of our American participants that the original and still best House of Cards is the British version, not the American version. So you should also familiarize yourself with that. So that's the show and tell part of today's program. But you know, it's if you want to know about what's going on in UK politics, it's probably better to go directly to the source instead of getting it from fictional television shows. And so that's why we're particularly delighted today that our friend Syed Kamall is able to join us and give us some updates. And I use the word update because, Syed, it was almost right about this time 5 years ago that we hosted you for I think then it was a Skype event for one of our luncheons. And it was just prior to the Brexit vote. And you, as one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, were talking us through it and giving us your prognostications. And I think it's fair to say that your attitude at the time was hopeful pessimism.
Yeah.
I think I recall that you were not confident that Leave would succeed in the referendum, but that you were hoping and that you were working toward that. So it's really kind of interesting, I think, now 5 years post, to talk about what has happened in the intervening time. How well has it gone? Did the sky fall or not? Did the fears of Remainers come true? Did the hopes and dreams of Leavers come true? Or is it some mix of maybe both? And in the intervening time, I mentioned to some folks yesterday that you succeeded in putting yourself out of a job with Brexit because the UK no longer has members of the European Parliament. But in at least one sense, you got a promotion, because since then you have been elevated to the House of Lords. So Dr. Matthews and I are going to engage you in a sort of a moderated discussion, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. But let me ask you first, just to talk for a couple of minutes about the post-Brexit experience and how has that gone? Has it gone generally well? Are those of you who pushed for Brexit, are you happy and pleased with how things went, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, well, first of all, Tom and Meryl and IPI, thank you very much for inviting me back. I've always appreciated engaging with you. And also, I'd like to thank your audience for making the time to be here. I'm sure there's lots of other demands on all your time. I think I'd start off by saying, I hope I said this at the time at the referendum. In any referendum debate where it's a black and white issue and it's yes or no, and it's a polarized issue, and you've got a choice of voting Leave or Remain, there will be claims from both sides. And some of them were reasonable claims, and other claims from both sides I thought were just exaggeration. The sky is going to fall in if you leave, or the other way around. If we stay in the EU, it'll be terrible. We'll end up with this kind of awful United States of Europe, and we'll be relegated to the periphery. And then you had sort of some of the more reasonable discussions. And I think that will be the same way people think now, looking back at Brexit. Most people in Britain, have, whether they voted leave or remain, accept that the British people voted to leave in the referendum. There were a couple of years where we couldn't quite get it sorted out. I think my personal view, and I've written about this, I thought we entered the negotiations and made a number of mistakes in the negotiations. And I have written about this elsewhere. Maybe I can put a link somewhere to that. And therefore, we let the EU set the terms of the negotiations. And since then, there was a bit of back and forth between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There were coalitions shifting in the House of Commons. Some Conservatives left the Conservative Party and went and tried to form a new party. Some people left the Labour Party and tried to form a new party. And it all became quite a mess. And then in the middle of all this, Theresa May stopped being Prime Minister. She resigned, and Boris Johnson came in and he said, I'm going to the country. We've been waiting too long enough. Let's just get Brexit done. And at that time, I really wasn't sure what was going to happen. I wondered whether that was, we may have won the referendum, but would there be a majority for parties that wanted to block Brexit and reverse the decision referendum? And it was quite clear from that general election in 2019 that Boris Johnson got a parliamentary majority of 80+ seats, a strong majority, and it showed that basically that message. There were two main messages in that general election in 2019. First, get Brexit done. These 3-word slogans that really resonated, and the second one was people were terrified of the option of a Jeremy Corbyn government. Quite a hard left-wing government. And one of his main advisors was a upfront Marxist on these issues. So that was clear that we had the mandate. And since then, most of my friends who voted Remain said, look, actually, in that general election, I also voted Conservative because I just think we had to respect that decision, and it was just getting too messy. Now, most people also would say, I think, that except those people who will never accept the result. And you've got, and I believe in free speech, people have got a right to express that view. They would say it's gone terribly. But a lot of the predictions that what would happen from the Remain side have not come true. George Osborne, for example, said there would have to be an emergency budget. Nothing of the sort. There were claims that nobody would trade with us. We'd be like North Korea or at the back of the queue. That hasn't happened. And there were some concerns from sort of free market conservatives and classical liberals who they were split in the referendum, and some were worried that the UK leaving the EU might lead to a more protectionist UK. And in fact, what's been really great about this is the fact that Liz Truss, our Secretary of State for International Trade, has really been incredibly energetic in signing new trade agreements. Some of those have been continuation trade agreements with the EU, and some of them have been new agreements, and others have been saying, okay, we'll sign the continuation agreement now, but we will try and increase that relationship, and it'll be a deeper relationship than the existing EU trade. And we've also got rid of we used to be part of when we were part of the EU, we were part of the common external tariff, because it was a customs union, not just a trade area. And I think at the time, 47% of the stuff that came in to the UK was tariff-free. When we announced our new UK global tariff, it's now 60% is tariff-free. I think at one time we announced an ambition for it to be 90%, but as you know, the lobbyists got to the government, the agricultural sector, the ceramic sector, and a few other sectors, and so therefore we didn't meet that ambition. I would also say that any change wasn't going to be overnight. I didn't believe that Brexit was going to just be one day you're in the EU, next day you're not, and there were always going to be some teething issues. And we have a particular teething issue at the moment with the Northern Ireland Protocol, where effectively one part of the UK is supposed to still be part of the United Kingdom in terms of the customs union of the United Kingdom, but it's also part of the single market of the EU to ease goods across that border. And that has led to real complications. And one of the issues has been the disproportionate number of checks that the EU are putting on stuff leaving, goods going into the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. Now, we see that as bad, not showing goodwill, but of course, let's not forget the EU are perfectly entitled to be tough because that's what they were all the way through the negotiations. They also want to send a message that leaving the EU is not easy. So if I just, I know it's quite a long answer. One of the things that was really interesting about the referendum, I was in Brussels the day after the referendum because I was one of the leaders of the big groups in the European Parliament, and we got called to a special meeting to reflect on the referendum result. And a number of my friends said to me, you've got to realise this is not just one country leaving the EU. If you leave and make it easy, and also make it and show that you are better off, this could be the end of the project. Other countries might follow and unravel. And part of the reason that the EU was so tough in negotiations was partly because, you know, it's good to be tough in negotiations, but secondly, they were terrified of other countries leaving. And they were successful in that because at the European elections in 2019, some of those parties in other countries that had it in their manifesto to leave the EU quietly dropped it from their manifesto. So job done in that way, that, you know, the UK's left, look how tough it is, look how tough it's going to continue to be, don't think it's easy. And they were successful in that way. But overall, a lot of the forecasts about the UK economy being in, you know, free fall, nobody trading with us, and even with COVID, you know, we've proven that those forecasts wrong.
So Syed, let me weigh in on that, because you have the issue of, I think the vote was in June of 2016. And my understanding is you didn't actually finally leave until December of last year.
Yes.
So you've got that sort of process of 4 years or so. So were you leaving all along? Or if you made a prediction that things were going to be great or terrible, do we not really know that until after December, because that's when you're finally out? Or have you had enough of a sort of a trial separation over those 4 years that you kind of know where things are going? It's not clear to me, since you didn't finally leave till December, if we really know whether these things are going to happen yet or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. But even those who were quite strong Remainers, you know, would say it was going to happen overnight. The fact that you've signaled that you're going to leave will be disaster. That clearly hasn't come true. But no, there are some issues. You know, our fishermen are facing certain issues, for example, in trying to land their fish, because that, you know, we overplayed our hand on fisheries because we had lost all our other bargaining chips, if you like, and the EU is going to play tough with us, and we've got to recognise that, you know, they've got to continue to show other countries that leaving is not easy. And so there are a few teething problems. Northern Ireland Protocol is one. Some of our fishermen, for example, the fact that we've are unable to land their fish and place it in them and get them to the markets they want. So there are some teething issues that we have to resolve. But it's not the disaster that people said, you know, the day after you leave, you know, it's going to be a disaster. No one wants to come to your country. And also some really terrible claims made by both sides. Let's be honest. I'm not saying that, you know, Leave with the Angels or Remain were awful on this, but both sides. But one of the claims that was made by the Remain campaign was, you're going to kick out all these EU people from the European Union. And we said, no, Leave never said that. If people who had already come to the UK and had made their home in the UK, you know, they would be given settled status. And also many of them are actually applying for British citizenship as well.
So there was no actual sort of economic recession or downturn or anything like that, even temporarily, that happened that would be attributable to Brexit?
I think there were in the first month, actually, to be fair, in terms of dip in UK companies exporting to the EU. And I think there's some of them are still facing those issues. But one of the things that people are not quite clear about yet is how much of that is COVID related and how much of that is trade diversion as well. And look, one of the things you all know about this, as any trade negotiations whatever happens, you get dispersed gains and concentrated losses. And therefore, there will be some people who immediately lose out because they had a very simple access to the European market. And I had that as a consumer, quite a few consumers in the first month in January were saying that they'd bought stuff on the internet from EU countries, and it was being held up in warehouses. Now, one of the solutions that the UK were proposing at the time was, let's just let everything in, you know, and intelligence will tell us if there's anything dangerous coming in. But also some of the firms were not clear about which paperwork they would have to fill in post-Brexit, because the decision was made quite late, and there wasn't a long transition period once it was definite that we were leaving.
So when you talk about negotiations, can you give us an idea about what some of the things were that had to be negotiated? And I remember reading in the press over the course of Brexit that Britain, at least, was sort of a net payer into the EU, right? So there was at least the idea that Britain leaving the EU meant a lot less revenue coming into the EU. So, I assume that was part of what had to be negotiated, but what other sort of big pieces had to be negotiated?
I mean, what was very interesting about the whole negotiation was we should have negotiated the new agreement up front. And what Michel Barnier very cleverly did, and we went along with it, partly because we lost some momentum because our Prime Minister resigned. And therefore, so I'll talk back through that. That was one of the very early mistakes. Because David Cameron had decided to resign the day after the referendum, we were hit an impasse, or sorry, not an impasse, that's the wrong word, a delay in getting our negotiating strategy up to speed. Effectively, the Conservative Party was locked into a leadership battle. And so while we were involved in that leadership battle and the country was waiting for a new Prime Minister, the EU then got its ducks in a row and was very clear about its negotiating strategy. So by the time we came to the table and Theresa May had become Prime Minister, what she should have done, and we urged her at the time, is to say, let's negotiate the withdrawal and the new agreement. Because by negotiating withdrawal, it is a new agreement anyway. Let's not have two negotiations on this. Let's do it in parallel. Michel Barnier was very clever. So no, we're not going to do it in parallel. We're going to do it sequentially. We'll do the withdrawal agreement, then we'll talk about the new trade agreement between the UK and the EU. And we fell for that. We should have just said, no, we're walking away. But we didn't. Partly because, and the other thing was, Michel Barnier said to me regularly, he said, as far as I'm concerned, the best deal for the UK would be to remain part of the customs union. So have the same common external tariff with the EU, and sort of free trade within the customs union, but have the same external tariff with the rest of the world for goods. And sadly, some of our negotiators actually agreed with that. And that was part of the problem. And at the same time, there were a number of British politicians going over to Brussels and telling some quite senior politicians in Brussels and other European capitals, don't worry, we can reverse Brexit. We can stop it. So there were all these. I remember going to a meeting in Brussels, and a very senior German MEP said, "I've just met Tony Blair, and he told me that, they're going to be able to. There's going to be another general election in Britain, and they're going to win, and they're going to reverse Brexit." And so there were all these mixed messages coming from the UK, and that didn't help our cause at all.
So the one of the things that Donald Trump had campaigned on when you broke off and Brexit passed in 2016, that was then during our presidential campaign. Donald Trump said, "If I'm elected president, I will quickly enter into a negotiation with Brexit with Great Britain, and get this done." Were we ever able to come up with an agreement with Great Britain on a trade agreement? And how do you perceive the new Biden administration in terms of working with you on trade?
Yeah, so Donald Trump had one word for us about the UK, and it helped in terms of all those people who had referred to Obama's words about, if the UK leaves the EU, that we would be back of the line or back of the queue. I should just say an aside, which is interesting. I was in a meeting with 3 ambassadors from the Obama administration who told me they were in the room with Obama when he got the phone call from David Cameron, asking him to intervene in the referendum. And he said, it was interesting, Obama had asked them their view, should I intervene? Should I get involved with this? And of course he did. He did say, if the UK leaves, they'll be back of the line for a trade deal with the United States. The interesting reaction in our country was, why is he interfering? And secondly, are we really going to be back of the line? What, behind North Korea, behind Iran? Are we seriously going to be back of the line? What does he mean by that? But they told me afterwards that Obama did regret making that statement. And maybe he shouldn't have made that statement. Now, Trump was the opposite. Donald Trump had warm words. We're going to do a deal with the UK. It's going to get done. But Donald Trump is also a tough negotiator, or portrays himself as a tough negotiator. And one of the things he was very good at, you saw this with the NAFTA, what he does, he throws something out and says, I'm going to put these tariffs up. And this was explained to me by one of his ambassadors. He said, Trump's strategy is to make sure that you pick up the phone to him. If everything's going great, then there's something wrong because America's not benefiting. So I'm going to make, for example, when he announced tariffs on EU imports, I'm going to make Juncker pick up the phone to me. And so one of the things that we thought there was a lot of goodwill between the UK and the US, but we never got it over the line. And I suspect that was partly because, once again, I think the UK has probably been a bit naive, that we thought it'd be a nice gentleman's chat and we'll come to an agreement. Of course, the US are going to be tough negotiators as well, and USTR, and that didn't happen. What's interesting about Biden was initially, when people were looking at a potential Biden presidency, it wasn't quite clear whether we were going to have a UK-EU agreement, or whether we were going to just walk away from the table. And he made it quite clear that he wasn't going to consider a UK agreement until we'd done a deal with the EU. He wanted to see a UK-EU agreement before he talked to us about the US. We also know that he is instinctively quite pro-European. He's also very pro-Irish with his background. When I was in the European Parliament, I met him as the vice president. He came to meet with us as the group leaders and displayed his European credentials. So he clearly was going to prioritize, if he was going to do a deal at all, the EU over the UK. But if you look at the geopolitics recently, you can see Biden talking quite a lot to us in the UK now. Now, I'm not going to pretend this is all part of a special relationship, even though Blinken has used that phrase. But we are aligned, for example, on the Indo-Pacific as a defense against China's ambitions, for example. The EU had signed an investment agreement with China, and he was quite annoyed by that. So there are geopolitical issues that we're quite aligned, and I think that's the real politic now, that Biden and Boris can work together.
Well, let me follow up on that, on the issue of China. There have been tensions going on between China and the UK. I think you were more willing initially, and now you're becoming more China skeptic, I guess I would say. And you're freed up from the EU's position on what it does with that. So where does Great Britain go with China now?
I think that's a really interesting question, because, as you say, when David Cameron and George Osborne, David Cameron was our Prime Minister, George Osborne was our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our Finance Minister, we were very keen on being a sort of hub for China in Europe. I think he had talked about the UK being a place for the renminbi, the Chinese currency to be traded. I think what's happened from an international relations perspective, and in fact, what my colleague Steve Davis and I have written a paper about this on called Chinese Puzzle: Future Relations After COVID. I think much of the world have thought, if we engage with China in sort of a liberal institutionalist, liberal internationalist way, or IR theory, get China to join a lot of the international organizations and be a member of the world community via these international organizations, that will bring about change in China itself. We now realize that we have to now look at this in a sort of more realist perspective and a hard-nosed perspective. And I think what's really interesting, we've got a debate about what's happening, as academics and others in your part of the world will be having that debate. Some are saying that it's a new Cold War, and you've replaced the Soviet baddies with the Chinese Communist Party as baddies. I think it's still a challenge, but I don't buy this Cold War rhetoric. I think what's happening, there are two elements to it. One is that China, in its near neighborhood, still has long memories of being humiliated by the Chinese and the British historically. And they do not want to be dominated again in their neighborhood. Now, some of those issues, like the India-China border skirmishes, we've seen the first deaths on that border for 40 years. That's really a legacy of the British Empire. And I think we've got to be quite honest about that. That border was initially drawn by the British. The other thing is, the Chinese are not looking like the Soviet Union to export their ideology and topple governments and stuff like that. They are looking for access. And what they're looking for is access to raw materials access to technology and know-how, but access for the products and services of their companies to the world market. And part of that will mean that they will try and be the rule setters for finance and international trade and get involved in international bodies. Now, I'm not saying that's not a challenge. That is also a challenge, but it's not Cold War. That still presents issues for us. For example, their treatment of the Uyghur minority, their aggressiveness in their neighborhood, the fact, they ships on Malaysian oil rigs, always testing the Taiwan border, the law in Hong Kong. But we've got to be quite clear about what it is. China will be a challenge, and we've got to face up to that. And so we're now starting to be more skeptical in the same way that I think it's Korea and one other country, I don't remember who it is now, who will not buy telecoms equipment or essential telecoms equipment from China. We have now started to look at our network and say, core technology where stuff could be rerouted. We are not going to allow the Chinese to supply that, but some of the peripheral stuff probably we will allow. We've taken that sort of hard look at it, and I know our intelligence community are very concerned about cyber attacks, but also leakage of information and spying.
That was actually the next thing that I was going to mention, was the fact that it was very well received in the US when, from our perspective, it seemed that the Trump administration persuaded the conservative government to start yanking Huawei equipment out of essential networks and things like that, just because of this concern about the fact that, if you're going to have a challenging competitor like China, do you really want their technology at the heart of all your most critical systems, your communication systems and things like that? Let me ask you another trade question. So prior to Brexit, the UK was not an independent member of the WTO, right? It was represented at the WTO as part of the EU.
Yes.
Okay. Has the UK rejoined the WTO? Is that a whole separate negotiation that has to take place? How does that work?
No, we have a WTO ambassador.
Okay.
So and in fact we had been given we had initial conversations with the WTO, the previous Director General of the WTO, about the UK being there.
Okay.
So yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned the role of the Labour Party in the way this all played out, because it really does seem like the Labour Party picked if you were a member of Labour and if you were a Remainer, that was about as badly as a political party could play a hand, is to say this, hey, this is the moment that we're going to, surge hard left Marxist socialist with a touch of anti-Semitism mixed in just for fun, and to just put the nation off on your party. I mean, it really seems to me that Brexit would not be in the position that it's in right now had it not been for how badly the Labour Party screwed up.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of elements to that. It was very interesting, the internal debate in the Labour Party, because Corbyn had always been a Eurosceptic for left-wing reasons. When you look at the Leave campaign and Remain campaign, they were both coalitions. And so many issues. In fact, I'm giving a talk this week on coalitions, and I'm using the campaign, the referendum campaign, as an example of multi-party coalitions on both sides. And one element of the Leave campaign was the libertarian type globalists who felt that the EU was too protectionist, but also the hard left who thought that the EU was too liberal or too free market. Now, opposing reasons, but actually for that particular coalition, they thought Britain would be better out of the EU. Now, so Corbyn has always been quite Eurosceptic, and in fact, his advisor, Seamus Milne, had been very sceptic. And I was talking to a friend of mine who worked very much behind the scenes with left-wing organisations on the referendum, and he said, "Oh no, Seamus Milne was quite clear that he was." This is what he said to me. I don't know if this is true, but he said it was quite clear that they were Leavers supporters. Corbyn couldn't actually say he was a Leave supporter, but they did everything they could not to support the Remain campaign. Let's put it that way. So it wasn't as clear cut as you think. One of the issues that the Labour Party have found was that in some areas of the country, the leading Leave Remainers were actually Labour local councillors, had been disillusioned with the EU. I remember talking to someone at a Vote Leave get-together, and he was a Conservative MP for a northern seat. And he said, my biggest Leave supporters are not Conservatives, they are Labour Party members. So you saw that sort of division between sort of working class Labour voters and professional metropolitan Labour voters. But there was also one of my friends in the Labour movement described it to me like this. He said, there was a difference between the public sector, state sector trade unions and the private sector trade unions. Private sector trade unions, private sector workers were more likely to be Leave voters, and actually outside London and metropolitan areas in industrial places. The public sector, local government, universities, polytechnics, schools, trade unionists were more likely to be in metropolitan areas and more likely to be Remain voters. And that was a very interesting schism in the trade union movement. So it was, in some ways, that schism helped the Leave campaign. Had they had and what was also interesting, another stat I think was the top 20 Remain seats were Labour seats, the top 20 Leave seats were Labour seats as well. So that was a very difficult issue for the Labour Party to straddle.
Syed, my recollection is that Scotland generally opposed leaving Brexit. Yeah. You've now got rumblings of an independence vote coming again. What's your thoughts on Scotland and their desire? Did Brexit sort of enhance the notion that we as Scotland want to leave again, or are there other issues going on there?
I mean, you've got to remember the Scottish National Party, their one message or their big raison d'etre is Scottish independence. That is it. That's why they exist. That's not necessarily why they win votes, but that's why they exist. And they've been incredibly successful. I think this is their now fourth victory, as it were, in Scottish in Scottish elections. And they're saying it's different now. The last Scottish referendum was when the UK was a member of the EU. Scotland overall, on balance, was there were more Remain voters than there were Leave voters. Therefore, we should have another chance at this referendum. The people who want Scotland to stay in the UK say, "Well, hold on a minute. The last referendum you said was once in a generation. We're going to hold you to that." The Scottish Nationalists say, "No, that's different because we were part of the EU then." And I think they will continue pushing for a referendum. Frankly, I'm not necessarily in line with my party on this. I'm not an inherent unionist. My party is a Conservative and Unionist party. I'm a self-determination guy. And in the same way that I thought it was right the UK had a referendum to leave the EU. If the Scottish people want to leave the United Kingdom, they should be free to do so, and we should talk about that relationship. I really don't know where it's going to go now. I can't honestly say to you, hand on heart, there will be no referendum, or that there will be a referendum in 20 years. I suspect the pressure builds up. But what's really interesting is when you talk to some SNP voters, Scottish National Party voters, and the Conservatives say, don't vote for them because they're going to leave. So, no, that's fine. We'll vote differently in the referendum. We just, we're voting for the SNP for these elections, but we don't actually believe we're going to leave the UK. So it's interesting because even Nicola Sturgeon downplayed it before the last Scottish elections. She said something, I can't remember what the exact wording was, but now may not be the time. But when she got the good result, she said, now we've got to talk about the referendum issue. And there is an issue. Some people feel that it's going to be terrible if Scotland leaves the UK. I'm personally more relaxed about it. But I do have friends who voted Leave and said if they knew that a result was going to be Scotland leaving the UK, they would have voted Remain. So some people feel very emotionally attached to the union.
I think it's fascinating that you addressed that issue of self-determination, because that was going to be my next question. Because, for someone who is of a libertarian bent, as you are and as we are, self-determination is a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. So I was interested in sort of, what do you as a conservative, libertarian leaning kind of person think about things like Scottish independence? Because, from an American standpoint, it's like, what's the big deal if
Yeah, exactly.
if they want to be independent, let them be independent. But it's also my understanding that they're heavily dependent on subsidies of various kinds from Britain. So I guess there's partly a question about whether they could even make a go of it independently, right?
Yeah, and that's very interesting because there's some people say, oh, actually, if Scotland faced the reality, then they'd have to go back to the thinking of the Scottish Enlightenment, people like Ferguson and Adam Smith, and they would be this they're going to be sort of classical liberal free market utopia. I think that would take a bit of time, to put it mildly, or to be diplomatic about it. The first stage of change has to be realization, and there will be some real issues to be discussed. I mean, I know people who do believe in self-determination, but are worried about the defense side and said, you can bet your bottom dollar that Putin would be there, challenging us, buzzing their airspace as regularly, and therefore, the Scots would have to agree to a United Kingdom army, not just a separate Scottish army. So there are issues like that. The Scottish National Party say that they will be part of the United Kingdom sterling. They'll keep the currency. That's not a given. The UK could play the same game that the EU played to us, and say, we're going to be tough with you. There are issues that some of the Scots say, well, you've taken all our oil, and that's why you owe us all these monies from transfers. There's debates about where that boundary is drawn. So there'll be all these sort of back and forth discussions. But I think the key thing is there going to be another referendum? You can't always hold out by what opinion polls are saying, but just before the Scottish elections, the elections for the Scottish Parliament last month? Time goes so quickly. No, this month. Sorry, early May. The opinion polls were showing remain ahead. But what's interesting, number 10, our Prime Minister's office has set up a Scottish unit to try and keep Scotland in the Union, and people who've headed that, we've lost 2 of the heads of that unit recently. So I'm not sure that the government has really worked out how to deal with that issue if it becomes a hot issue.
Dr. Matthews, do you have another question?
I think I'd be ready to go to some questions or comments from the audience if we have some.
Well, I still have a couple, so okay. I'll try to get mine in real quick, and then we'll go to the audience. Syed, what are the big political issues and controversies right now in the UK? Setting aside, for instance, Scottish independence, which we've just talked about, but what are some of the most immediate policy issues? Are you as worried about inflation in the UK as we are in the US, economic growth, employment, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I'm as worried about inflation as you are. If you look at money supply and particularly M3, I think the Fed dropped M3. They tend to use, is it M4, M2? I can't remember which one now. We don't. We've got people who calculate M3 over here. I think we're really worried about and I think we were saying before we started formally, if you look at, there is inflation. People are saying, what inflation? And you're seeing asset prices, you're seeing stock market prices, your assets go up. I do worry about that increasing division between the haves and have-nots, and I think we should all be worried about that from a sort of social cohesion angle. And do we really want to live in nice places or have all this wealth, and we're walking past people who can't get on the housing ladder? Now, we've got an issue in the UK where we're overly centralised, and we've got a lack of housing in London and the southeast, and we haven't got enough supply for that. Whereas other parts of the country, they don't necessarily have this housing problem. But it's a really interesting political issue, because I remember talking to a Labour politician a few years ago, and he said, in the 2017 general election, one of the areas where Labour had a lead over the Conservatives was private renters. People who wanted to own a home but couldn't afford to own a home, didn't live in state subsidised housing, but were in the private rented sector. They were blaming the Conservative government for not being able to get on the housing ladder. And I think that's an issue that we've talked about, liberalising the planning. We've got, I'm sure you've got the same concept in the United States. We've got NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And we need to increase the supply of housing where people want to live. Part of the problem is that we're too concentrated in London and the southeast. And how do we spread that wealth around the country? The other issue is about that issue. If you look at the last general election, The Conservatives won seats where they haven't won for years or ever. We won some constituencies that have been Labour forever. And we had Labour voters lending us their vote, partly because they were worried about Jeremy Corbyn, but partly because of Brexit. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, they thought they subscribed to that message, get Brexit done. And what we've now got to show is how does the Conservatives keep that support? And it's not as simple as we think it is. Some people think, let's just be more socialist than the Labour Party and throw lots of taxpayers' money at these areas and bribe them with their own money. But one of the analysis that has been done is that what's happened in many of these areas, these post-industrial areas, is that where there was sort of industrial areas and coal mines, etc., private developers have moved in and built lots of private housing, and it's affordable private housing. And there was an interview, I think, in The Economist with a couple, and he earned £28,000 a year. His wife earned £12,000 a year. That's £40,000 a year. He had a 4-bedroom house in a park outside London. And he said, life's pretty good for me. If I lived in London, I wouldn't be able to afford this. Even not even a 1-bedroom apartment or a studio apartment on £40,000 a year. So one of the questions for the Conservative Party is, how do we keep what we call the red wall, it's turned into the blue wall. How do we keep the red wall blue? And I think that's one of the biggest issues. Then you've got lots of localized issues, such as there are parts of the UK where we have ridiculous levels of knife crime, and we really haven't decided worked out how to tackle that issue. Sometimes sending people to prison actually trains them to and makes them worse. And so we haven't really worked that out. And there are issues clearly with our, now that we've left the EU, some of the people who voted to Remain, who were quite classical liberal, were thinking that the United Kingdom might well get these powers back, but we might be more protectionist or more interventionist than the EU. In fact, there's a Swedish guy, you've probably come across him, Frederick Eriksson, who writes about trade. Mm-hmm. And he said, it seems, given some of the policies from the Tory government, that the UK has left the EU and is now becoming more like France. We've got some more intervention. We've become more interventionist, and so I think that's one of the challenges. What is the post-Brexit vision for the UK? Yes, we're going to be a global Britain. We're going to sign trade agreements, but also let's be realistic. We've just had a review of our foreign policy and our defence policy. We've actually announced that we're going to have more nuclear warheads. Now, I can understand some of those announcements, but I'm not quite convinced. What does a medium-sized power like the UK, what is the implication, and what is the need to have a few more in nuclear warheads? I don't really understand that from a geopolitical strategic perspective. I can understand the other issues. Let's move to let's focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Let's have a situation room. Let's tackle cybercrime, all those issues. But we've got to define ourselves as a global Britain post-Brexit, and I think we're still coming to terms with that.
Syed, back to the inflation issue. Yeah. The Federal Reserve Bank in the US has been on an expansionist mood for several years and kept interest rates very low. And we've just not seen inflation here like we thought we might have, like economists would have projected. Yeah. Has inflation been low there for many years, and or has it crept up at various times?
Yeah, nominal inflation is low. And there's some great, there's a guy called Dominic Frisby who's a comedian, but also a serious writer on financial issues. And he keeps tweeting examples of, things going up, house prices going up, shrinkflation, as I was talking about, same price, but you get less of the product, and stock markets going up, housing prices going up, other things going up, and saying, yeah, what inflation? So there is inflation, but I think we were fortunate as we opened up and traded more. Some of that has been disguised, if we're honest about it, by global supply chains, moving production to other countries. Chinese products and in shops have suddenly has counteracted that consumer inflation. So the consumers are not necessarily seeing it so much, except for certain products, but we're seeing it in the stock markets and in the housing market certainly.
Well, just for your information, we have some people writing on financial issues who are apparently comedians also, but it's not intended.
Oh, I see. Of course, they're actually making the decisions. They know that
Right,
they don't
right.
know. They don't know they're comedians. Is that right? Yeah.
So Dr. Matthews, you think anytime someone talks about modern monetary theory, they're actually doing a stand-up routine? This is what you think.
It may well be. At least
so
they get a lot of laughs from us.
So I think, and we've been saying for some time that, and in fact, we had a publication during the COVID crisis about inflation, the next threat, because I don't think people have been serious about it, and they're confusing a couple of things. They say, oh, well, we can pay off the debt. Don't worry. Yeah, okay, you can pay off the debt in theory with such low interest rates and maybe refinance stuff. And you've been through this in the war. We had high levels of debt, and we paid it off. But you've also got to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control, because that makes it much more expensive to pay off that stuff.
Yeah, and our experience with inflation is not that it's easy to get under control.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the scariest thing to me, is hearing governors of the Federal Reserve Bank here in the U.S. talking about inflation as if it's something that they can just dial up or dial down as they see fit. Yeah. And that is not the history of inflation.
Have you had the same thing that we've had, that we've redefined inflation as well? So, and the indices that you use and the basket of currency, a basket of goods, because we used to use RPI, retail price index, then we use the CPI, the consumer price index, then we took out housing as a factor. That's clearly changing. Now we've got something called CPIH. If I'm right, that's consumer price index with some housing priced into it as well. So
the index in the U.S. that's considered most reliable is called CPI-U. But it's also recognized that probably still undercounts inflation, that the formula is not really that great. I find it interesting that you are associating higher stock markets with inflation, because I normally do not associate those things. But you've got you're starting to get the same sort of reports that we used to have, like in the 1970s, where it seems like every time you go back to the grocery store, food prices are a little bit higher. And, when food costs start going up, as we've always said, inflation really hammers low income and working class people, because it starts at those basic commodities that you've got to have: fuel and energy and food and housing and things like that.
Yeah, and sometimes having a relatively open economy disguises some of that, because then you've got imports coming in, and actually people don't see necessarily price increase. They might not necessarily see price decreases, but they don't experience those increased prices, or they see certain products. And also, people will go. I'm probably going to be too technical here, not technical, but too behavioural here. Some people will switch brands as well, especially if they've got choice. So they may not buy the particular well-known brand; they might buy their own brand. And what's interesting in our country, and you have Aldi as well, don't you, over there? Is that right?
We do, yes. It's usually the very lowest cost grocery store. Anywhere
so
there's an Aldi.
So Aldi and Lidl have done very well in the United Kingdom market. And it's really interesting. And they find that even middle class shoppers have switched to Aldi and Lidl. And I remember talking to a chap who was a Lidl strategist years ago. He said, we have a limited number of lines, but because we bulk purchase that's how we can offer the cheaper prices.
Sure.
And also we make it almost similar as much as we can. There's a bit of sort of trademark and branding imitation going on there. But they know their market very well. They don't have as wide a range, and they can keep the prices low that way.
I have to ask you a question about the House of Lords, and then we will go to our audience. So, first of all, congratulations. But second, I'm not sure many of us in the U.S. really understand the role of the House of Lords, because it's not really a parallel to our Senate in the United States. And I think my impression of the House of Lords is that there's a large number of people who hold lordships for various reasons, but most of them are not actually active in the day-to-day functioning of politics, whereas I think it is your intention to be so. Could you just explain sort of to the U.S. How Lords works and what its role is, and sort of what you see as being your role there?
Yeah, so the House of Lords, I would say, and you're absolutely right, it's not exactly like the Senate. I would say it's like an appointed Senate. Yeah, so people are, and more, we used to have a long tradition of hereditary peers, and we've got some bishops from the Church of England, and we've kept the church. When Tony Blair came in, he reformed the House of Lords. it was always supposed to be an interim stage, and no one's quite agreed on what that last stage should be. I mean, there are people like me, for example, I'd be quite happy if it was an elected Senate of about 300 people, and it was quite clear, though, that the House of Commons had precedence on legislation. But what the House of Lords does is really important work. I'm not saying that because I've been appointed there, but what we do is we go into the detail of the legislation. And I was told by one of my fellow lords when I went in there, he said, look, because we were both in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament, we got into quite a lot of detail about the legislation. We actually wrote detailed amendments and crossed things out. And he said, those skills come in very handy in the House of Lords, because quite often what we get from the House of Commons, we get a bill, and to use an English phrase, it's a dog's dinner. It's all over the place. We know what the intention is, but there are so many unintended consequences of what they're proposing, and we tidy up that a lot. And what you'll then do is quite often the House of Lords will have amendments that will get voted on, the government may oppose them, and then it goes back to the House of Commons for a second reading. Now, the House of Commons may say, we accept that, or they might throw it back to the House of Lords. And we have this thing called ping pong. So sometimes we're told, get ready for this week. It's ping pong on the trade bill, for example. And eventually what happens is that the government will take on some of the amendments that have been proposed, or they will assuage fears and say, look, we can look at that, or we can tackle that issue, or what about this compromise wording, for example, that we're happy to pass. But ultimately, what's clear is the House of Commons has precedence. So it can go over so many times, but at some stage, the Lords just have to give in. And just before the session of Parliament just ended before the Queen's speech, and in that last week, we were trying to get stuff through. And sometimes the government took on the amendment and said, yeah, we see what you're trying to do here. And other times it said, no, we insist on keeping our line, and the House of Lords would step back. What you've got to remember about the House of Lords, and one of my colleagues who'd been in other places said to me, he said, it's more collegiate, it's more, there's no majority party, there's a governing party, but you don't have a majority. But most of the amendments are not necessarily political. They are from experts who understand the law and the implications of that law. So you will get political amendments, but you'll also get, you'll get amendments which are just saying, think about the unintended consequences, think about what you're trying to do here. We're going to help you frame this legislation better. So we're really a revising chamber more than anything else.
But Commons does not require the House of Lords to sign off on something for it to become law. Is that right?
No, we have. We'll come to us for a final read, and we do agree. Either we've given way on certain, and what you'll see is in subsequent readings, the number of amendments tends to drop off, because what's happened is that the Commons have either accepted it, or the government has accepted it, or the Lords have been persuaded that their concern will be addressed.
Okay, very good. Well, why don't we go to our audience and try to take some questions? We have a question from our friend Bob Hyde about Scotland, but I think you've already addressed that. He wanted to understand Scotland's current relationship with the EU, and they are still a member of the EU, or they are not?
No, they're not. Because they're part of the United Kingdom, they're not a part of the EU.
Okay.
And I should have said that, sorry, in my answer to my question. There are some Scottish nationalists who are saying, we will rejoin the EU as Scotland. Now, what's interesting about that factor is that there are a number of countries who would not accept Scotland joining, because they're worried that it would give encouragement to some of their separation movements. So, for example, the Spanish are very worried that the Catalans would then say, look, Scotland's left and joined the EU, we can leave now and stay in the EU. And also parts of, for example, the Basque Country, for example, and other parts. So there are clearly, clear concerns about a part of the United Kingdom leaving and joining the EU.
We got a question a couple of days ago in advance of this event asking about the possibility of other countries following Britain's lead and also leaving, because we do hear chatter about that. But I think, you went into pretty great depth on that. You think at the moment right now, the air is out of those balloons for those countries, just having watched how hard-nosed the EU has been in negotiations. Is that right?
Yes, but what's interesting it was some of the lots of the parties dropped it from their manifestos and their particularly in European elections. But you're now starting to see, and I think you'll see more of this as time goes on. Some of them are saying, there was one party in Sweden, I think, that said, when the UK makes a success of Brexit, that might encourage us to want to leave the EU as well. That's one spokesman for one party, but I think they're now it's very much a wait and see. If the long term, if we show that the long-term gain that we've gained long-term from leaving the EU, might give encouragement, and they might then say, look, yes, it will be difficult, but the pain is worth it. But at the moment, it's too soon for that. You really have to see.
I could see countries saying, now that Great Britain has left, it's sort of shown the way as to how you do this.
Yeah.
And so I understand the EU's fear that if it's easy, more countries will do it. But my sense is that once one country takes the step, others say the follow-up may be a little easier. They may see it as a little easier for them because now they know the traps they can run and how you do that. So whether you meant to or not, you may make it a little easier for other countries to take that step if they decide.
That's a fair point. But then there are some politicians from other European countries who said to me, and they didn't want Britain to leave, because they said, what's going to happen when Britain leaves? Some of the stuff that we hide behind you on, or we look to you to lead on, for example, liberalisation and trade and over centralisation. We're going to be outvoted on this. But there is also the issue of some of them say, look, we're not Britain, we can't leave. We couldn't leave and be successful on our own, but we understand why you've left. And so I've got friends for exactly that reason who said, we understand why Britain has left, but we couldn't do that even if we wanted to.
Well, let me ask you a related question on that leaving, because the BBC has flown me over a couple of times to go around Wales, and they would film me on welfare issues. And we'd do a whole week, and then they'd run it on their thing called week in, week out, or day in, day out, or something like that. And the first time I went over, a number of Polish people were coming over into especially Wales and taking the jobs that a lot of the Welsh didn't want to take because they were lower paying jobs just above minimum wage and so forth. Are you having, now that you're out, I mean, it was easy for Polish and other people to come over at the time. Is that still the case, or are you going to sort of clamp down on that ability to be able to come in and work from immigrants since you're no longer part of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been one of the concerns, and I think that's one of the issues I'm slightly concerned about, which is one of the reasons that people voted on immigration, and this is on both sides. The Remain people said, yeah, we're pro-immigration, but we want European immigration. There's this, and some of them, it was genuine, they felt European, and these are European brethren, and we're all part of the same family. There were others who were very interesting, was probably subtly racist. We want the right sort of immigration, and I think what they meant was the white sort of immigration. They wanted, they preferred white immigrants rather than non-white immigrants from the rest of the world. And the people who voted leave, yes, it was quite clear there were some people who just said no immigration, but on the two other groups, which I think outnumbered it, were the people who said, I want immigration, but I just feel there's no control. Anyone can come from the EU. There's no way of controlling that. And the third group was saying, well, hold on a minute. And I fell into this third group. Why are we giving priority to white Europeans over the rest of the world? Surely we should have the best people from all around the world. In the short term, I think there are going to be concerns about, if we can't recruit local labour, is it going to be easy for people to come over? And I think that's one of the issues that we're going to have to address. And why is it that we can't get local labour? Because it's very interesting. Some of the people who are anti-immigrant, they make two conflicting arguments. They say they come over and take our welfare, or they come over and take our jobs. Well, which one is it, guys? So let's be clear about this. One of the things that's good about immigration is people coming in to do the jobs that local people don't want to do. And I think there might well be some pinch points, and hopefully that will then encourage us to have a more amenable immigration policy.
We have a question from George Ward. George says he's heard news post-Brexit about shortages in Britain, especially vegetables and things like that, maybe that were sourced in French farms or things like that. Is that true? And if so, do you see that as just a temporary thing, or do you see that as something that would be a long-term concern?
I think some of it was temporary, and there were some short-term things. But the great thing about the UK is that we have supplies from all over the world. But there were some. I mean, I don't personally remember going to a supermarket and seeing the shelves empty. But then, to be fair, and maybe that's the point George is making, was that due to COVID or was that due to Brexit? And there's been a bit of confusion. People blaming Brexit for stuff that was due to COVID and supply chains. But there was a lot. There was new paperwork, and a lot of the people who were imported into the UK or exporting from the EU countries to the UK were not clear about that paperwork. And I think part of that was, I can understand the argument, maybe there should have been a longer transition period, or a period where that you continue without paperwork, as it were, until we got this up to speed. A lot of exporters now are telling, and I think I gave you the example of people who bought stuff from the EU now suddenly face barriers or tax, because before, with they hadn't. Now that we've left, they have to pay UK VAT, value-added tax, and there are issues like that. A lot of those things have come through, and we're resolving them. But I do think it's, we are not like the Soviet Union at empty shelves. Our supermarkets are full of stuff, but I do think there might be one or two exporters from the continent phasing out issues. Was that due to our negotiation strategy? It may well have been. And what I mean by that was, because May's government had negotiated so badly, we didn't have very many bargaining chips when Boris became Prime Minister. And the chap who led his negotiations, David Frost, Lord Frost, overplayed the stuff that we did have. So one of our negotiating chips was access to British fishing waters. And we played that for everything it was worth. And so, you can't come in here, and we're still playing that. And then that caused resentment from our European negotiators. But that was partly because we had very few chips left when it came to negotiations. Yep. And there are still some issues on fishing. And also the EU's introduced checks. So for example, the stuff from Northern Ireland, which is supposed to come to the rest of the United Kingdom, what happened is a Northern Ireland Protocol. And what happens is it's a bit like if Texas was told that you had to be part of a single market with Mexico, for example, but you're still part of the United States, but you have to have a single market with Mexico. That's what's happened with Northern Ireland. So effectively, you've got a kind of border along the Irish Sea. Now, in the past, we've always had a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland, but the EU has introduced more checks, disproportionate number of checks at that border, and that's directly a result. So both sides are trying to, as we look at some of the issues post-Brexit, are playing up their bargaining chips. And the Northern Ireland Protocol is probably going to have to be renegotiated at some stage or trimmed. And I think some of those issues might be a result, because only late in the day did we start being tough on the negotiations.
We have a question from David Cam about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And about the news that the UK was either considering or has already decided to grant passports to certain people from Hong Kong if they decide they want to leave and return to the UK or move to the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about that, what the status of that is?
Yes, I mean, to be fair, David, I'll look it up and I can email you, or I'll put my email address in the chat later if people want to follow up with questions to me. I'm not entirely sure about the status on this, but we are saying, effectively we're saying that, by granting Hong Kong citizens the right to come to the United Kingdom, hopefully that reassures them. And frankly, my own view about this is that here is the United Kingdom taking some responsibility for its former empire, the Commonwealth. There are still so many parts of the world that the United Kingdom hasn't. That people are still there's still issues that are a result of a couple of people in the 19th, 20th century drawing lines on a map, or the legacy of the British Empire. There are still, some of the issues are still there. I mean, you saw this with. Sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. You saw this with some of the attacks and the terrorist groups in the Middle East, I think ISIS actually said Sykes-Picot, that drawing of the drawing of lines, caused many of the problems that we still see in the Middle East today. So it's interesting, even 100 years later, we're still talking about some of those issues. As I said, I think the India-China border is partly that, that those were drawn under the days of the British Empire. And it's really, I was very reassured by the fact that we were given support and comfort to the people of Hong Kong. But in terms of the technical question, David, I'm very sorry I don't have the technical answer to that. But I will put my email address in the chat. Please resend me the question, and I'll try and get a more technical answer for you.
In general, it was very well received in the U.S., especially among conservatives, when that news came out, because it did seem like a pretty heroic thing, frankly, for the U.K. to do for folks in Hong Kong who are having the rug pulled out from under them in slow motion, so to speak.
And also, I mean, two things. One is, I think Britain has to accept some responsibility for this. We thought we signed an agreement with China. And we thought that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, would stick to that agreement. Clearly, they haven't. So and we reassured the Hong Kong population at that time that everything was going to be all right. I mean, the British were very slow as well. Let's be honest. We did not bring in multi-party democracy in Hong Kong before we left. Okay, we had the assembly and all that sort of stuff, but I think the Chinese government are absolutely right to point to some of the hypocrisy of the UK on this. But there were also some of the free market friends who were saying, why don't we just resettle all the people in Hong Kong and Scotland? Can you imagine what a dynamic, enterprising part of the UK it would be? And therefore we wouldn't have to send all this taxpayers' money from London to the southeast up to China, up to Scotland and Northern Ireland. So. I'm very reassured by that, but I'll get the exact details to David at some stage.
A lot of us free marketers, we always want to turn every place into Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Here in the U.S., here in the U.S., we talk about trying to turn Puerto Rico into our Hong Kong, and settle that. And so it's kind of funny that people want to turn Scotland into Hong Kong.
Exactly. And who's our John Cooperthwaite? Where is
well, that's the problem.
Yeah,
that's the problem. So I have a question from Lane de Alvarez about the lockdown. She wants to know about the approach that the Conservative Party, the Conservative government took in the UK on the COVID-19 lockdown and regulations. It seems like they've been more draconian in the UK than they've been in the US, and it seems like they're still pretty draconian from what we can hear. So what can you tell us about what's going on with regard to COVID-19 policies and lockdowns?
Yeah, I'll start off with a sort of more philosophical point, and I'm sorry this wasn't the question that was asked, but I don't know if you've ever come across Professor Mark Pennington from King's College in London. He wrote a paper for us on Hayek and COVID, and he said, look, Hayek looks at the world as complex systems, normally economic, but you could look at the response to COVID as a complex system. There are all these different interacting things. And the way you learn in a complex system is that there's a discovery process, and you will make mistakes, but you'll learn from those mistakes. And that's the way he felt that you tackle an issue like this. So I think lots of people have made mistakes, and I think our government's made a mistake. I think, frankly, any government would have made a mistake. There's still questions. Did we lock down too late? Did we lock down too early? But what was also interesting, my colleague Steve Davis makes this point, was that people were already starting to lock down themselves. They're already stopping. They were already. So, for example, we had an IA event here just before lockdown, and this is before the government even announced lockdown. But when people were starting to see stories about COVID-19 and traveling to places and weren't sure about it, we had, the room was supposed to be fully booked, and we had a 80% no-show. Now, most events would have like a 10% no-show or whatever. And that was people who were already deciding not to go out so much and travel, and they're already asking their companies whether they could work from home. And because we didn't know about the nature of the threat, even classical liberals argued that we understand the role of government at this stage. And I wrote a piece for our blog because I'd surveyed what classical liberals were saying. These are emergency measures. This is emergency time. The challenge will be when we emerge from it, how much of this stuff will they keep? There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program, if you like.
Right.
And therefore, and classical liberals and free market people here are quite split on this issue. I'm quite cautious, and I think it's best to be cautious, particularly the unknown. I didn't think we were going to get a vaccine. I'm glad we've got a vaccine, and people are feeling reassured. I'm coming to the office more. Other people are coming to the office, and we're doing it in stages. I think the danger is that if you ease the lockdown and it starts to spread more, it's more difficult to tell people to go back home or stay home or whatever. And are they doing it right? Are they being too cautious on dates? At least they've given dates and they've looked at the data. But there are obviously some people who say it wouldn't have made any difference. I'm one of those people. I think we were right to be cautious. I know people will disagree with me on this. Have we been too cautious? Only time will tell. At the moment, there's one variant in this country, and even people with a vaccine are worried about getting that Indian variant. So the government has said we're going to look at the data in the run-up to June the 21st, which is the next stage of easing. At the moment, in April, we eased so people could have meals outdoors. We can now go into restaurants and have meals, but it's still a limited number. The full opening up is supposed to come on June the 21st. But if, for example, we have lots and lots more cases and cases start to rise again, we may delay that opening up. So I personally don't think it's draconian. I think it's understandable, but I do know there are people who think it's draconian. And you've seen the protests. We've had protests in the streets, people saying, it's being locked down. I will give on this one, I give the government the benefit of the doubt.
I think it's interesting that I think most of us would be more or less in that same place, at least in the early days of the pandemic, because as you say, you really don't know what you're up against. But I think there's a general idea here in the US that governments have been too slow to open up, especially with the success of the vaccine rollout. I mean, we're to the point in many parts of the US where anyone who wants to get the vaccine has had an opportunity to do so. And the very large vaccination facility near my home shut down this weekend.
Right.
Just because very few people are taking advantage of it anymore. So, the idea seems to be shifting to, once people have had an opportunity to be vaccinated, then what is the justification for keeping things closed? Is the vaccination rollout going at a good, healthy pace in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that we can be fortunate about. And in fact, once again, Mark Pennington's paper says this. He said, I think the solution will be found by discovery, but it could be found as much by accident than by purpose. Now, the British government made some decisions pretty early on, which have been vindicated. So, for example, we bought some vaccines up front, even before they'd been proven. For example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and this is why the EU got a little bit annoyed with us, because we'd secured that supply first. Also, the EU were unable in the plants in EU countries. For some reason, I don't know why this was, they weren't able to ramp up production as quickly as our factories in the UK were. And I don't know that. I don't think it's a result of being British and European. I don't think it's anything inherent, but I'm never quite sure about that. And it's interesting, the French government made a decision and they bought some vaccines from Sanofi, a French company. This was going to be the great French champion. That vaccine didn't work. We were fortunate that we bought a vaccine from AstraZeneca, which did work. And what the other thing that we realized was our politicians realized that our Department of Health wasn't very good. And how are we going to get these vaccines out? So we actually planned it as a military operation. We got military planners in to help us decide about how to get those vaccines, how to have a mass vaccination scheme. And also, where we didn't have the skills, for example, the cold storage delivery, we actually went to companies that had that. So we have a company here called Boots, which is a large pharmacy chain, and they have that skill of transferring vaccines in cold storage. And we use them to help us transport stuff and get it out. So we used the best of the state and the private sector to get that rollout. And we were lucky. I mean, you could say lucky, but it played out. The fact that AstraZeneca vaccine worked for us.
Syed, it's interesting because for all the grief that Boris Johnson gets for his leadership on various things. You've actually done, from the UK standpoint, y'all have actually done quite well in compared to a number of the other European countries on your ability to be able to get the vaccine and get it rolled out and going faster than a number of the countries.
Yeah, and I think it shows as well, but it's a snapshot of the time. If you look back at the beginning, I think we stumbled, and there are other countries, and we had a large number of deaths. And part of that is we hadn't thought about what do you call it, social care, care homes for the elderly. That's where a lot of our stats were coming from, and we hadn't thought about that. And so at one stage, people were saying, "Look at Britain, how terrible they are. Look at Germany, they are the leaders." Or look at whoever. Look at where we are now. People now, I've got my German friends, and I've got my wife's sister lives in Germany. We're saying, "Look, you guys are doing it brilliantly." Now, that could just as easily change in a year's time. What happens if our supply chains don't work suddenly? Or, events, we've learned this from COVID, something that you don't predict. We could be looking at a year's time that Germany are doing brilliantly and the UK aren't doing. So far, touch wood, we are doing well. And we've learned, I think the great thing is we've learned from our mistakes. Whether we have been too cautious, I think we'll look back at this with hindsight. And we'll have the benefit of hindsight. But I think I'm very pleased. I'm proud that how well we're doing, but I don't think we should necessarily be sort of jingoistic about it or whatever. We were quite, in some ways, it might be by accident we backed the right horse at the right time.
Yeah, there are a few people out there being a little too cavalier, I think, and a little too judgmental about, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think those in elected office had to make difficult decisions, and they had to make them with the information that they had, and they made various decisions, and we'll be looking back for decades, I think, on those decisions and figuring out which ones were right and which ones were wrong.
And Hayek talked about the conceit of knowledge and our limited knowledge, and absolutely right. And this is a great example. I think it's a great example of that. So I don't think, sometimes I'm slightly worried when I see British politicians come across as triumphalist and say, look at how well we're doing compared to other countries. Yes, but was that by design or was it by accident? And also, things can still go wrong. Not everyone has had 2 doses of the vaccine yet. There was a challenge that India was going to start holding back on some of it. And I can't remember who it was, did an analysis of how many parts go into a vaccine. And it's an unbelievable number of countries involved.
Something like 400, I think it was. Yeah. I saw that.
Yeah, and you think about that, and and that's one of the issues that's been shown up in modern time with just-in-time delivery. How brittle some of these supply chains could be, unless you build redundancy into them.
So you mentioned a minute ago, you mentioned events, and I want to close with this final question, and that is that sometimes major events like this have long-lasting political consequences. I think here in the U.S., our politics is still dominated by the ripples of the financial crisis and the bank bailout and all that sort of thing. I think that caused a long-term, almost like rejiggering of some of our political coalitions and things like that. And I think it's still going on. Do you have any thoughts or speculation on how the COVID-19 experience might have long-standing political consequences? I mean, we already here in the U.S. see politicians running, either for or against their record of the decisions that they made and things like that. You have challengers who are saying, the elected governor or the elected mayor or county judge was too restrictive and didn't value freedom enough and things like that. So do you have any thoughts about maybe what some of the political consequences might be from this experience? I mean, granted, it's probably too soon, right?
Yeah.
To know.
But people don't like that answer when you say it's too soon. I'll get back to you on that. I suppose. So I'm thinking very carefully. One of my colleagues, I think I mentioned him, Steve Davies, wrote a really interesting paper about past pandemics and this pandemic and lessons. And he said one of the things that you might see is an acceleration of pre-existing trends. So, for example, we already had the Zoom technology, and we already had the Teams technology, but now we're actually using it more. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to switch it all off when we go back. And there will be huge debates about remote working, home working, and what about companies that insist on their employees coming back to the office? And also those companies that have made decisions, they say, oh, well, all our staff can work from home. That's fine if you're fortunate, you're my stage of life, you've got a family home and you've got enough rooms in the house that everyone can work in during the day. But if you're a young renter and you're all battling over the kitchen table for the internet and all that, you know, it's not so easy for a young professional just starting in a shared apartment or whatever. So I think there'll be some issues around what back to work means and coercion. I think what we saw in the general election, not general election, we had a set of local elections and the Scottish elections in the UK. The Conservatives were rewarded in some ways for, even though we made stumbles at the beginning, for the way that we handled COVID. People now see the light in the tunnel. You know, there is a vaccine. No one was sure there was going to be a vaccine, and we are rolling out the vaccine program. Interestingly enough, in our devolved region of Wales, the Labour Party, who rule that part, they made some mistakes at the beginning, but also because their vaccine rollout in parallel with ours is doing well, they were rewarded for that. So that was interesting. But I think there'll be issues, for example, about the nature of work. I think there'll be some issues about, we've got the furlough scheme, the government paying companies or paying employees directly instead of putting them onto the unemployment benefit and then taking them off again. Are we keeping dud jobs or dummy jobs or zombie jobs going longer? And do we just have to accept that at some stage? And in any change like this, the winners and the losers. You know, I think we've got to be very aware of when anything changes, the winners and losers. I think I see your London Underground mug there or whatever it is. One of the questions we're not quite sure about is what's transport going to be like? You know, is it going to be, you know, we've got all this investment in commuter lines and high speed lines, but it's not, people aren't using it. Or is it going to be, people are going to go in 2 days and 3 days from home? And what does that do to revenues for transport systems? I think aviation will bounce back once we're allowed out and everyone's been vaccinated around the world. Not quite so sure about commuter systems and trains and buses and things like that. And I think there'll be a lot of politics, a lot of politics around that. But I think at the moment it's about competence and who's been seen to be reacting. And at the beginning, like most governments, we were making mistakes all over the place. And in some ways that we are now seen as more competent. And some of my opponents my political opponents were telling me, you've been lucky that Boris has sorted this out. Now, has he really sorted it out? Was it him? Was it by design? It doesn't matter. We are where we are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was going to tip my London Underground, give you a tip of my mug there to conclude. So I appreciate you recognizing that. And I also appreciate you not insisting on being called Lord all throughout this whole discussion, because that's a very awkward thing to an American.
No, it's fun. I mean, it's funny because I now get, even from my friends or people I've known for years, dear Lord Kamall. I think, for goodness sake, call me Syed. You know, just call me by my first name. And I don't mean that as false modesty. Oh no, please don't tell me how wonderful I am or anything like that. You know, oh no, please don't. No, please don't mention it. You know? I'd rather, no, really don't mention it. You know, I'd rather, it's a title as far as I'm concerned, and. Yeah, it's part, if I'm going to be in the House of Lords, you are called Lord or Baron, whatever. But, as far as I'm concerned, I see it very much as an appointed Senate and a revising chamber. Sure. That,
well, it's also an honor, and it's an honor that you're worthy of. And so congratulations, and we're happy for you.
Thank you very much. And also, I thought I'd retire from politics. I was quite happy to spend my 1 day a week teaching at a university, international relations, and spend 4 days here at the IEA as the academic research director. And to be plucked out of my early retirement was quite, it was a nice feeling. And it's nice to be asked to go back. And I must say, I felt really good that day I walked in for my introduction. I was quite sad as well. My father didn't live quite long enough. He died last September, and it's quite, and I know how proud he would have been. And I could have imagined him walking with me on that day. But that's the way life is. But I feel incredibly privileged. I've been very lucky in my life, and sometimes you make your own luck. And I know, my father always told me there's no limit to what you can achieve if you believe in yourself, believe in God, and work hard. And I hope now, in the way that he inspired me, I hope to inspire the next generation.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful, unplanned, but wonderful way to end this discussion. So we really appreciate your time, Syed. Again, congratulations on being elevated to Lords. And we look forward and hope we'll be able to reconnect with you, on an ongoing basis when there's time and when there's good reasons to do so. I want to thank Dr. Matthews also for helping today with the discussion. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and this will be archived on our website and on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with other people that you think might be interested. And then again, I want to mention again, for those of you who are interested in getting more involved with IPI or who would like to talk about joining our Giving Society, please do connect with Addie Crimmins. You can get her contact information off of our website, and she would be delighted to talk to you. So Syed, have a good evening. For those of you in the US, have a good afternoon, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. And I'll put my email address in the chat for anyone who wants to contact me.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for attending, everyone. Thank you.
Very much enjoyed it.
Take care. Bye.